She wasn't the kind of woman men looked at twice. That wasn't cruelty. It was just fact, the quiet kind that settles into a person over years until they stop flinching at it. Margot Finley had spent the better part of a decade making herself easy to overlook. She wore sensible shoes and cardigans in shades of grey. She kept her dark hair pulled back so tight it gave her a headache by noon. She arrived before anyone else and left after the cleaning crew. She did her job, and she did it extraordinarily well, and she asked for nothing in return except to be left alone with her spreadsheets and her very large iced coffee. She was 31 years old, soft in the way that made strangers on the subway offer her their seats. And she had not been on a date in 2 years, 4 months, and she wasn't counting, approximately 11 days. She worked for Evander Rook. That fact alone would have been enough to give most women pause. Evander Rook did not have a business card that said organized crime. But anyone who paid attention to the obituaries in certain Philadelphia neighborhoods knew what his name meant. He ran the city's most profitable import operation through a constellation of legitimate-looking shell companies, 3 warehouses near the port, and a restaurant on Locust Street that had never once turned a profit and had never once been shut down. The people who owed him money paid it. The people who crossed him disappeared. Not dramatically, not in ways that made the evening news, but quietly, efficiently, the way Evander did everything. He was 42. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against softness, dark eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and hands that were both elegant and terrifying, depending on what he was doing with them. He wore bespoke suits that cost more than Margot's monthly rent, and he wore them like he'd been born in one. He also had a gift for numbers that most people didn't know about, which was why 3 years ago, when his previous accountant had made the catastrophic mistake of skimming $11,000 from the Locust Street books, Evander had calmly handled that situation and then posted a very specific job listing through a very specific recruitment firm that catered to people who understood that discretion was not optional. Margot had applied. She'd gotten the job. She had never once skimmed a single dollar, had never asked a single question she wasn't supposed to ask, and had never given Evander Rook any reason whatsoever to notice her. Until the night she let Thomas Acker take her to dinner. It started, as most disasters do, with good intentions. Thomas worked at the firm that handled Rook Logisticus' legitimate tax filings, the above-board portion, the public-facing layer that gave the whole operation its plausible deniability. He was 34, pleasant-looking, and the first man in recent memory who had seemed genuinely interested in what Margot thought about things. He had blue eyes, and a way of leaning in when she talked, like what she said actually mattered. She'd said yes to dinner, mostly because she was tired of saying no. She'd spent 20 minutes in the bathroom of her apartment, trying to decide what to wear, which was 20 minutes longer than she'd spent on anything related to her appearance in months. She settled on a dress she'd bought on impulse 2 summers ago and never worn. Deep plum. The kind of fabric that draped rather than clung, that was forgiving where it needed to be and made her feel, for approximately 45 minutes before she left the apartment, like someone who deserved to be taken to dinner. She'd even worn her hair down. Thomas had chosen Ardor, which was either a very confident choice or a very naive one. Ardor was the kind of restaurant where the menu didn't have prices and the bread came with its own ceremony. It was exactly the sort of place where people went to be seen, which meant it was also the sort of place where Evander Rook's people sometimes ate. She hadn't thought about that when she'd said yes. She thought about it later, a great deal. Evander Rook was not supposed to be at Ardor that Tuesday. He was supposed to be in a meeting with 3 men from the Hargreave family, who were trying, not very elegantly, to renegotiate the terms of an arrangement that didn't actually benefit from renegotiation. He'd agreed to the meeting, because he was in the habit of letting certain people believe they had options, right up until the moment it became useful for them to understand they didn't. The Hargreave sit-down had been scheduled for 8 o'clock at a private room on the north side of the city. It had been moved. Someone on the Hargreave side had gotten a call they wouldn't explain, and the meeting had been pushed to Thursday, which left Evander with an evening suddenly empty and a hunger that room service wouldn't fix. His driver took him to Ardor because Evander had, for reasons he didn't examine too carefully, been thinking about the lamb dish there for most of the afternoon. He didn't make a reservation. He didn't need one. The maitre had put him at the corner table by the window, the one that the staff held back on busy nights, for exactly this category of guest. Evander ordered Barolo and declined the bread ceremony with a single gesture, and he was in the process of deciding whether the salmon or the lamb when he looked up because the light near the entrance changed. The particular way it changed when the door opened, and someone walked through who made the room pay attention without quite knowing why. He looked toward the door, and he stopped. The woman standing at the host's stand was wearing a plum-colored dress and had dark hair that fell past her shoulders in waves. He had never once seen before, because every single time she had sat across from him in his office, or walked down the corridor to the conference room, or handed him quarterly projections in manila folders, her hair had been pulled back in that same utilitarian knot that somehow managed to make her look both efficient and invisible. He knew the slope of her shoulders. He knew the way she turned slightly to the right when she was listening carefully. He knew the precise cadence of her knock on his office door. 3 beats, always 3, measured and deliberate. He did not know she looked like that, Margot Finlay, his accountant, his quiet, invisible, never think about twice accountant, was standing in the entrance of Ardor in a dress the color of dark wine, and she was laughing at something the man beside her had said, and the laugh transformed her face in a way that made Evander Rook, for the first time in a very long time, lose track of what he was thinking about. The maitre led them to a table near the center of the room. Evander watched. The man with her was tall, well-dressed, the kind of generically handsome that photograph well at weddings. He pulled out Margot's chair. He handed her the menu. He said something else that made her laugh again, softer this time, a little self-conscious, and she tucked a piece of hair behind her ear in a gesture so unguarded that Evander felt something tighten in his chest that had no reasonable explanation. He drank his wine and looked away. He looked back 30 seconds later. He ordered the salmon and ate approximately half of it. Across the restaurant, Margot was doing her best to be present. Thomas was explaining something about international tax codes that she normally would have found interesting. She understood international tax codes. She had, in fact, restructured the import tariff documentation for Rook Logistics twice in the last fiscal year in ways that saved the operation somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000, which Evander had acknowledged with a 2-word email that said good work, and which she had, to her own mild embarrassment, saved. She smiled at Thomas. She ate the risotto. She asked him follow-up questions about the international tax codes. She tried not to think about the fact that the dress felt different than she'd expected. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present, like it was reminding her constantly that she was wearing it. A woman at the next table glanced at her and smiled. It was the kind of smile that was entirely kind, the sort that said, "You look lovely tonight," without the condescension that sometimes came packaged with such smiles. Margot was so surprised that she smiled back before she'd processed it. "You seem distracted," Thomas said, not unkindly. "I'm not," Margot said, and then, because she was trying, "Tell me about the Barcelona office. You mentioned it when we talked on the phone." He did. His face lit up. He had a whole story about the Barcelona office and an expense report that had been submitted in 4 different currencies, and she laughed genuinely this time, because it was a good story, and Thomas told it well, and the wine was excellent, and for a small stretch of that dinner, she forgot to be invisible and just was. She did not at any point look toward the corner table by the window. This was not because she hadn't noticed. She had noticed the moment the maitre d' led her, and Thomas passed the window side of the room, that particular stillness at the corner table, that presence that didn't need to announce itself. She had spent 3 years developing an extremely reliable peripheral awareness of where Evander Rook was in any given room. It was a survival skill. You didn't work where she worked without knowing exactly where the most dangerous element was at all times. She knew he was watching. She did not know what to do with that information, so she filed it the way she filed everything she didn't know what to do with. In a locked cabinet in the back of her mind, labeled "Not Your Business, Margot, let it go." She let Thomas refill her water glass. She smiled at his Barcelona story. She ordered the chocolate tart for dessert because it had been a long 2 years and 4 months, and she was sitting in a restaurant in a purple dress, and she was, tentatively, having a good time. Evander called for the check at 9:47. He did not leave. He sat with an espresso he didn't particularly want and watched the way Margot Finley ate her dessert. Carefully at first, then with a small private abandon that suggested she'd stopped performing and was just eating the thing. She had a small smile on her face. Not at Thomas. Just at the tart. The thing he couldn't stop thinking about was this. She had always been there. Every Monday morning with the week's figures. Every Thursday with the consolidated reports. Every time there was a discrepancy, any discrepancy, anywhere in the books, she found it, not because she went looking for trouble, but because she understood numbers the way Evander understood power, intuitively, at a structural level, the way you understood things you'd lived with long enough that they became part of the way you thought. He had never thought about why she always found her way to the edge of the chair rather than sitting back in it. He had never wondered why she'd worn cardigans in July. He had never considered why she answered questions about herself in 2 sentences or fewer, and then redirected efficiently back to whatever problem was in front of them. He was considering all of it now. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Evander set down his espresso cup. Not loudly, not in a way that anyone would notice, but with a precision that communicated, to anyone who'd learned to read him, that something had just shifted. Margot looked down at Thomas's hand over hers and felt something she could only describe as nice. Uncomplicated and warm, like a cup of tea on a cold day. He was looking at her with an expression that was genuine and hopeful and entirely decent. She was thinking about what she might say. Something real, something that wasn't deflection, when she became aware of a change in the texture of the room. It was the same thing that happened in Evander's office, sometimes, when a meeting stopped going the way someone had planned. A pressure drop. A recalibration of everyone in the vicinity, without them quite knowing why. She did not look up immediately. She waited 1 beat, 2, long enough to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Then she looked up. Evander Rook was standing 6 feet away. He was not looking at Thomas. He was looking at her, with the same precise analytical attention he gave to contracts before he signed them, and to people before he decided what they were worth. It was the look that made men in expensive suits sweat through their jackets in his conference room. It made Margot's hand go completely still under Thomas's. "Mr. Rook," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Miss Finley." His eyes moved to Thomas. They stayed there for exactly long enough to make Thomas remove his hand from hers. "I'm sorry to interrupt." He did not sound sorry. "This is Thomas Acker," Margot said, because the alternative was silence, and she'd been in enough of his silences to know they weren't neutral. "He works with the Callaway Group. He handles the firm side of the annual filings." "I know who he is," Evander said. Thomas cleared his throat. "Mr. Rook, big fan of the, big fan," He stuck out his hand. Evander shook it once, the kind of handshake that contained information. "Enjoy your evening," Evander said. He looked at Margot one more time. 1 second, no more, and she could not have told anyone what the look meant, except that it landed somewhere between her ribs and didn't leave. "Miss Finley, I'll need the Q3 reconciliation moved up. Monday instead of Wednesday." "Of course," she said. He walked back toward the exit. He'd already paid, she realized. He'd been leaving. He'd gotten up to leave and instead had come over here and stood at their table and done whatever that was. Thomas watched him go. "That was normal," Margot said, and picked up her wine glass and took a very long drink. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. Margot spent most of both of them at her kitchen table in her robe, working on the Q3 reconciliation she'd moved up at Evander's request, telling herself that the reason she'd moved it up without question was because that was what she did. She was accommodating. It was a professional strength, and also, she was aware, a very convenient way to avoid examining things. Thomas had texted. "Had a great time. Would love to do it again," she'd responded. "Me too. Soon?" She hadn't set a date. She went to the office Monday morning in her usual grey cardigan, her hair in its usual knot, and put the Q3 reconciliation on Evander's desk before he arrived. She sat at her own desk, in her own office down the hall, and answered emails for an hour, and ate the breakfast sandwich she'd brought from the place on Pine Street, and was, in all outward respects, entirely normal. At 10:15, she heard his footsteps in the hall. She had very good ears for his particular way of walking. Unhurried, fully weighted, like a man who had never in his life needed to rush toward anything, because everything eventually came to him. He stopped in her doorway. She looked up from the monitor. "The reconciliation was right," he said. "It usually is." Something moved through his expression. Brief, she almost missed it. "It is," he said. "Always." She waited. He looked at the grey cardigan. He looked at her hair. He looked at her face, the way he'd looked at it in the restaurant, and this time she had nowhere to redirect, because there was no Thomas, no dessert, no ambient noise of an expensive room to absorb the attention. "You look tired," he said. "I worked all weekend." "On the reconciliation?" "On the reconciliation." He stepped fully into the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, which was as close to casual as Evander Rook ever got. "You didn't have to work the weekend. I moved the date because I needed to verify something by Monday, not because I needed you to lose your Saturday." "I know," Margot said. She looked at her screen. "I just wanted it to be right." "It always is," he said again, and there was something different in it the second time, like a statement becoming something else. Margot. She had worked for this man for 3 years. He had called her Miss Finley approximately 300 times, in offices and conference rooms, and once over a phone call from what had sounded like a boat. He had never once called her by her first name. She looked up. He was looking at her in a way that her locked mental cabinet had absolutely no file for. "You had your hair down," he said. "On Tuesday. I was off the clock." "You were," he agreed. "You looked." He stopped. Evander Rook did not stop in the middle of sentences. He was not a man who ran out of words or lost his way through a thought. She had seen him navigate conversations with federal investigators and rival organization heads and people who were trying very hard to intimidate him, and he had never once hesitated. He hesitated now. "Different," he finished. Which was not, Margot understood perfectly well, what he had started to say. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the dress on Tuesday, a persistent, impossible-to-ignore presence. "Did you need something from the Q3 report?" she asked. "I can walk you through I don't need the Q3 report." "Okay, Acker," he said. The name landed flat, like he'd set it on the desk between them. "Is that ongoing?" Margot's eyebrows moved. She couldn't help it. "That's not really." "No," he said. "It's not. You're right." He straightened from the doorway. He looked at the window, then at the floor, then at her, and she had the genuinely disorienting experience of watching Evander Rook work something out in real time rather than simply arriving at conclusions fully formed. I'm going to need you to come with me to the Carrington meeting on Thursday. I wasn't scheduled for the Carrington meeting. You are now. The Carrington meeting is a dinner. Yes, she looked at him. I don't attend dinners. You attended one Tuesday. There it was. She'd known it was there. She'd known, from the moment she'd looked up in the restaurant and found him standing 6 feet away, that it was going to surface. She just hadn't known when, or in what form, or whether she was going to be brave or cowardly when it did. She looked at Evander Rook, standing in her office doorway. This man who had never, in 3 years, asked her anything personal, who had given her exactly 2 words of praise in 40 months of near-perfect work, who had stood up from an expensive restaurant to come over to a table he had no business approaching, who had just used her first name for the first time like it had cost him something. What time? She asked. The change in his face was small. Someone who didn't know him wouldn't catch it, but she knew him. She'd had 3 years of reading the precise topography of his expressions across conference tables, and what crossed his face was not quite relief, but something adjacent to it, something that had been waiting. 7:30, he said. I'll send a car. He walked back down the hallway. She heard his office door close, quiet and certain, the way he did everything. Margot turned back to her monitor. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her calendar, cleared Thursday evening, and did not think about the purple dress or the fact that it was still hanging on the back of her closet door where she'd put it after Tuesday, not quite ready to push it back into the section she thought of privately as not for me. She thought about it instead as Thursday, 7:30. Send a car. The Carrington meeting was not, in any significant way, about the Carrington account. Margot understood this within the first 15 minutes, which was roughly how long it took to establish that the Carrington figures she'd been asked to bring were not going to be needed, because the 2 men across the table from Evander were not actually interested in figures. They were interested in something else. Something territorial. Something about a distribution arrangement on the south side of the city. And Margot sat at Evander's right hand and took precise, irrelevant notes and watched him dismantle their position with the same quiet, total efficiency he brought to everything. She wore the purple dress. She had told herself she was wearing it because it was the only appropriate option she owned for a business dinner at this level. This was technically true. It was also, she acknowledged privately, not the whole truth. She had worn her hair down. She didn't look at Evander during the dinner itself. She didn't need to. She could feel exactly where he was. Not because she was watching, but because 3 years of working within his orbit had calibrated her to him in a way she'd never examined directly, the same way you knew the weather before you looked out the window. When the Carrington people excused themselves briefly, some kind of phone call that both of them needed to take, which Margot suspected Evander had engineered. He turned to her. They were alone at the table. Candles, the remains of an excellent meal, the particular quiet of a room where something was about to be said. "You're not taking real notes," he said. "There's nothing real to take notes about." "No." He reached for his wineglass and didn't drink from it. He turned it slowly in his fingers. "What do you think of them?" "Nervous," she said. "The one on the left checks his phone every 4 minutes when he thinks you're not looking at him. He's waiting for confirmation from someone who isn't at this table. The one on the right is the decision-maker, but he doesn't want to be seen as the decision-maker, so he keeps deferring to the left, even though the left is waiting for instructions. They came here to agree to whatever you're actually offering. They just need cover to do it." Evander looked at her. "The left one's cufflinks don't match," she added. "He got dressed in a hurry. He was scared coming in." The silence stretched 1 beat, 2. Then, "I've been wasting you. You've been paying me exceptionally well." "That's not what I said." He set down the wine glass. He looked at the table, then at her, with the same expression he'd had in her office doorway, the one that still didn't have a file. I want to say something to you. Okay, I'm going to say it badly. She had never, in 3 years, heard Evander Rook acknowledge any kind of limitation. She put down her pen. I saw you Tuesday, he said, at our door. And I? He stopped again. He looked like a man who'd built his entire life on never needing more than one attempt at anything, confronting the specific frustration of needing more. I've seen you every week for 3 years. I have never. He stopped a third time. You never noticed me, Margot said. Her voice was level. It wasn't bitter. It was just true. She'd been the one to make it true, after all. You couldn't be invisible without intention. I noticed you, he said. I just didn't, he exhaled. I didn't look. She understood the distinction. It was precise, in the way that things he said were always precise. The dress, she said. It wasn't the dress. He said it with a quiet certainty. It was the way you were laughing. You don't laugh like that in the office. No one laughs like that in your office. You don't laugh at all in my office. You smile when you're being polite, and you look at the door. When you want me to stop talking, and you have 3 different ways of telling me I'm wrong, without ever actually saying I'm wrong. Something almost moved the edge of his mouth. I've catalogued them. Margot stared at him. I've been paying attention, he said, inficactly. Without understanding what I was paying attention to, he looked at his hands, then at her. I'd like to correct that. The restaurant noise filled the space between them. Glasses and soft conversation and the distant percussion of a kitchen. All the ordinary sounds of the world continuing while something in Margot's carefully organized interior rearranged itself without asking permission. Correct it how? She said. Not a question, exactly. Dinner, not like this. He glanced at the empty seats across the table. Without an agenda, without a car sent to your address. Somewhere you choose. He paused. And I'd like you to wear your hair down, but that's a preference, not a condition. She looked at him for a long moment. You're still my employer, she said. Yes, that's complicated. Yes, he said again. There was no qualifier, no pivot, no attempt to make it smaller than it was. He was Evander Rook. He didn't minimize things. I know what I am. I know what working for me means. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm asking anyway. The Carrington men came back to the table. Margot opened her notepad. She looked down at the clean page, and she wrote, Thursday, her choice, hair down. Then she turned to a fresh page and began taking very precise, very real notes about the South Side distribution arrangement, while across the table, the man on the left began, slowly, to give up the position he'd come in pretending not to have. She gave him a restaurant, small place on Fabric Row, family-run, the kind of menu that changed with what came in from the farm that week, mismatched chairs, no ceremony with the bread. She'd been going there for years and had never taken anyone with her because it felt too much like showing someone something real. She wore the purple dress again. She thought about wearing something else. She wore the dress. He was already there when she arrived. He was sitting with his jacket on, which was unusual. She'd seen him take it off in long meetings, seen him roll up his sleeves. And it took her a second to place why. And then she understood. He'd worn it for her. He'd arrived first and kept his jacket on because he was treating this like something that warranted the effort. He stood when she walked in. That was also unusual. Evander Rook did not stand for people. He existed in the same room as them, and they oriented to him, not the reverse. She sat down across from him. The candle on the table was the kind that dripped wax, stuck in a wine bottle, and it threw uneven, warm light across his face and made him look, briefly, less like a man who ran the south side of Philadelphia and more like just a man at a table. You found it, she said. Your directions were exact. I'm an accountant. He actually smiled. Not the edge-of-the-mouth thing. Actual, complete, briefly transforming his entire face into something she had never once seen in 3 years of Monday mornings and Thursday projections. She felt it like a change in air pressure. They ate. He ordered without the performance she'd expected. Simply, attentively, asking the server questions about the preparation in a way that was genuinely curious rather than evaluative. He poured her wine and didn't make it significant. He asked about her family, and she told him her mother in Allentown, the younger brother who was finishing his residency, the way she'd ended up in accounting, not because she'd planned it, but because numbers had always made sense to her in a world that often didn't. He listened the way she'd always listened to him, completely without waiting for his turn. "No one in the office knows where I'm from," she said at some point. "No one in the office has asked. You haven't asked either until tonight." "No," he said. "I haven't." He turned his wine glass. "I'm asking now." She told him more than she planned. About the apartment she'd rented sight unseen when she moved to Philadelphia, and the way it turned out to be directly above a bar, and she'd considered moving for 2 full months before deciding the ambient noise was actually comforting. About the way she'd looked up Rook Logistics before her interview, and understood immediately what it was and applied anyway. Because the numbers were interesting, and the salary was significant, and she'd thought, with the optimism of someone who hadn't yet learned better, that she could keep her head down and do her work, and the rest wouldn't touch her. "And did it?" he asked. "Touch you?" She looked across the small table at Evander Rook in his dinner jacket in a restaurant with wax-stripped candles, who had just asked her, in full seriousness, whether his world had gotten into her. "Not in the ways I was afraid of," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. "That doesn't change. You can't promise that." "No," he agreed, "but I can make it a priority in a way that it hasn't been, that I can promise." He paused. "I protect what's mine, Margot, with everything I have. The problem has been that I didn't see you clearly enough to understand you were." He stopped, reconsidered, that I should have been doing that already. The candle dripped wax onto the table between them. Outside, Fabric Row was quiet, the brick warehouses holding all their old-century history in the dark. "I texted Thomas," she said. "Last week. I told him I didn't think we should continue." "I know." She raised an eyebrow. "I asked," he said. Not defensively, just a fact. "You checked on me?" "I have kept tabs on everyone in proximity to my operation for 15 years. It would be extremely strange to stop now." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to pretend to be a different kind of man. But that particular piece of information made me relieved, in a way I didn't entirely expect." She thought about this. She thought about the filing cabinet in the back of her mind, the one she'd been adding to for 3 years without ever really looking at what she was storing. "My hair's down," she said. "I noticed. It gives me a headache when I wear it up all day. I know. You rub the back of your neck when it starts." He said it simply, without calculation. He had not apparently been hiding the fact that he watched her. He'd just been doing it with the same precision he applied to everything, and calling it something else. She reached across the table and turned his wine glass right side up, the way he'd been turning it in his hands for most of the evening. "One dinner isn't enough information," she said. "No," he said. "I'll need more data points." Something moved through his expression, relief again, and something warmer underneath it, something she suspected he didn't show anyone and wasn't entirely comfortable showing now, which made it, to her, more real than anything expensive or performed could have been. "I'll make time," he said. She picked up her fork. Outside, the city did what it always did, moved and shifted and carried on in all its calculated chaos. And Evander Rook, who ran a significant portion of it, sat across from Margot Finley in a restaurant she'd loved for years and waited, without impatience, without performance, to learn the rest of her. Which was, she thought, perhaps the most surprising thing about all of it, that she wanted to let him